we're going to do a historical journey. So we're going to begin at the beginning. Don't worry, you don't have to go back to biblical times with me. But we're going to begin with the early attitudes of the Reform and the Liberal movement at the beginning, really, of the emergence of their movement. It's important to think about the context that, of course, the modern Zionist movement, just like the Reform and the Liberal movement, emerge as responses to modernity, right? With our religious movements emerging as a religious response, and the Zionist movement emerging as a nationalist response. So the time of birth of our movements and Zionism kind of coincide. Now, when we look at the different early attitudes, I would title it reservation and rejection. I would title that time period reservation and rejection. It's true both for the liberal and for the Reform movement, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. So officially, the liberal movement, the early liberal movement, adopted a policy on Zionism which was neutral. Officially, the movement as such claimed neutrality. However, despite this official stance of neutrality, two of the three founders of the liberal movement, we fondly talk of them as the three M's of liberal Judaism, Rabbi Israel Isidore Matter, Claude Montefiore, were active anti-Zionists, with the third M, Lily Montagu, showing little interest in Zionism or Israel. Likewise, leading reformers adopted a reserved attitude towards the concept of political Zionism. In many ways, the attitudes of liberals and reformers were predictable, bearing in mind the background and social status of its adherents and the movement's commitment to the ideals of citizenship, as well as the universalist belief of progressive Judaism. As Matic put it, the universal hopes of liberal Judaism and the national hopes of Zionism are opposed to one another. So as Britain began to debate the possibility of a Jewish state in British Mandate Palestine, of course, Britain here in a unique position, unlike other countries, because Palestine at the time was under British control, liberal Jewish leaders joined others in the British Jewish community in opposing the establishment of the Jewish state. Claude Montefiore, for instance, at the time a president of the Anglo-Jewish Association, co-authored a letter to the Times, not the Financial Times, the Times, in May 1917, the year of the Balfour Declaration, in which he and David Alexander, then the president of the Board of Deputies, explained that emancipated Jews in this country regard themselves primarily as a religious community. Rejecting the idea of Jewish nationality founded on religion, Montefiore and Alexander concluded that the only alternative would be a secular Jewish nationality recruited on some loose and obscure principle of race and ethnographic peculiarity, but this would not be Jewish in any spiritual sense, and its establishment in Palestine would be a denial of all the ideals and hopes by which the revival of Jewish life in that country commends itself to the Jewish consciousness and Jewish sympathy. On these grounds, the co-joined committee deprecate most earnestly the national proposals of the Zionists. Now, if you thought it was only the liberal movement that was opposed to Zionism, they were in good company. Rabbi Morris Joseph of the West London Synagogue wrote in his response to the proposals that were later formulated in the Balfour Declaration, the less political the new Jewish order in Palestine proves to be, the nearer it will approach the ideal one. The three M's, Matic, Montefiore, and Montego, wrote a joint letter to the government opposing the Balfour Declaration. Likewise, Philip Magnus, who at one point was the assistant rabbi at the West London Synagogue, but at this stage is already professionally active outside the Jewish community and involved with the reform movement in a lay capacity, also wrote to oppose the Balfour Declaration. So the differences between the approach of liberal versus reform Judaism can only really be found in the nuances of the rationale presented for the rejection of Zionism. While both movements shared concerns about dual loyalty, the documents suggest that liberal Judaism's opposition was particularly tied to its core philosophy. Liberal Judaism, from its inception, emphasized a religious identity over a national one, making political Zionism conceptually challenging. Reform Judaism, while also expressing universalist ideals, seems to grapple more with the practical implications of Zionism for Jewish citizenship and social integration. Now, despite these outspoken rejections in the early years of the movements, political Zionism was by and large considered a strictly personal matter and not subject to the censorship of synagogal bodies. I think this is really important. While there were loud voices against Zionism, this was not the official policy of our movement. Especially in the provinces, there were outspoken pro-Zionist voices, including Dr. Joseph Strauss in Bradford, who had, together with his wife, attended the Second Zionist Congress in Basel in 1898. The most outspoken Zionist in the early years of the liberal movement was Rabbi Morris Perlzweig, the first liberal rabbi to be ordained in Britain and second minister at the liberal Jewish synagogue alongside Matek. I can see David's comment about saying we have a Jewish state now. I'll come to that, don't worry. We're still in the early years before the founding of the state, so just hold on to your seats for one more moment as we come through the history here. Now, as early as July 1926, at the inaugural conference of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, so when the World Union for Progressive Judaism was founded in London, Perlzweig had raised this Zionism as a topic for discussion, asserting that liberal Judaism and Zionism were not in opposition, and arguing further that it was essential for the World Union to adopt a Zionist stance, as he believed that an anti-Zionist movement could never hope to have influence in Eastern Europe. Interesting perspective there. Perlzweig, of course, failed to win over others at the conference, and it was only in the early 1960s that under the leadership of the late Rabbi Dick Hirsch, the World Union fully embraced Zionism and then moved its headquarters to Jerusalem. So let's look at the next epoch in history, the impact of the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel. While under the editorship of Harold Reinhardt, the senior minister at West London Synagogue, the Synagogue Review, at the time the official journal of the Reformed Synagogues of Great Britain, attempted to ignore most developments connected with Zionism, making no mention at all, for instance, of the establishment of the State of Israel. Yet attitudes of progressive Jews towards Zionism in Israel began to shift significantly following the Holocaust, which had severely challenged belief in universalism and the ever-improving character of humanity. The establishment of the State of Israel also served, of course, as a sort of fait accompli. This is what David had commented. Just as David commented in our chat, Robert Enriquez of West London, for instance, noted, "I was against a Jewish state until it was created. Once it was created, there was no more room for argument." Within the Reform movement, Manchester in particular was a center of Zionist activity. But despite this variety of perspectives, the image that reform was either opposed or indifferent to Zionism also persisted. In light of the current controversy around the Board of Deputies, it is probably worth noting that when deputies of West London and other Reform congregations resigned in 1949, despite it ostensibly being in solidarity with the Liberal movement, whose request to be granted their own marriage secretary was denied, it was primarily because the deputies felt that the board was in control of the Zionist cause and no longer represented the views of British Jewry, but took rather orders from the Zionist organization. Despite an agreement that led to the return of all parties to the Board of Deputies, which was heralded as a successful conclusion to the fight against regimentation of opinion and the trampling on the rights of minorities, the non-Zionist element was increasingly described by contemporary observers as a minority, both within British Jewry and within Reform communities. Yet the Zionist controversy spilled over into the religious field too. Reinhard led those opposed to the introduction at services of a prayer for the State of Israel. So he argued strongly that no prayer for the State of Israel should be introduced. However, with Israel surviving the War of Independence and developing year by year, there was a gradual change to a more positive attitude. It manifested itself in a vote at the 1951 ASGB conference, the name of the Reform movement at the time, to add a prayer for the state. Looking at the liberal movement in those immediate post-war years, it saw a rapid growth resulting in the various smaller congregations gaining more say in the shaping of liberal Jewish policy. One of the first effects of this democratization of the movement was a shift in attitude to Zionism in the State of Israel. By 1956, the liberal movement's leaders formalized a position in support of Israel with certain caveats, stating there can be little doubt in our judgment that there is a duty to support or help the State of Israel. Nevertheless, the nationalistic philosophy of Zionism always has been and always will be incompatible with liberal Judaism. In May 1958, with the State of Israel celebrating its 10th anniversary, the lead article in the Liberal Jewish Monthly encouraged liberal Jews to celebrate the anniversary, but again with caveats. It had to be made clear that Jews were not a political entity identifiable with Israel. There was also uncertainty about Israel as a religious stance, and it said, the Torah will go forth ever more strongly from Zion, even as we hope it will go forth equally from London, Paris, and New York. So the move of the World Union for Progressive Judaism to Jerusalem, as I mentioned earlier in the early 60s, and the subsequent opening of the Jerusalem campus of the Hebrew Union College undoubtedly had an impact on the progressive Jewish attitudes towards Israel and Zionism in the UK. In 1963, the liberal movement passed its official policy to the State of Israel, stating that members of congregations should be encouraged to go to Israel to see the land for themselves. Congregations should establish scholarships at the Leobeck School in Haifa. Congregations should support progressive Judaism in Israel, work for institutions such as the Hebrew University, and plant trees in the ULPS forest. Ministers, nowadays called rabbis, should be given sabbaticals by their congregations to enable them to visit Israel. Religious observance of some kind should take place on the 5th of Iyar, Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day, and there should be a specific Israel content in the syllabus of religion schools. And 3 years later, in May 1966, the ULPS Council finally abandoned its previously neutral stance on Israel when it unanimously accepted the policy statement, which was prepared by the Israel Committee. The statement recognized that the original neutral stand was no longer appropriate, and that since both the World Union and Israeli progressive institutions had been established in Israel, there was an obligation for British liberal Jews to support them in every way possible. Service of the Heart, which was published at the beginning of 1967, was then the first British Siddur that offered a liturgy for Israel Independence Day, and a prayer for the State of Israel was included in the Shabbat morning liturgy. In the Reform movement, the attitude to Zionism turned into fervent support in the 1960s, as Rabbi Jonathan Romain puts it in his history of Reform Judaism. This was epitomized by Robin Hyman urging the RSGB to show more recognition of the remarkable fact that out of all the Jews in the last 2,000 years, it is we who have lived in the age which has brought the re-establishment of the State of Israel. The first RSGB tour to Israel took place in March 1965, attracting 120 participants and proving a great success. I'm really glad I don't have to run that tour bus. I'm going this next month. I'm taking 15. That's going to be enough stress for me. As a result of discrimination by various Israeli state institutions, the RSGB also threw its weight behind the World Union for Progressive Judaism's negotiations with the Israeli government to remove these restrictions. An RSGB Israel Commission chaired by Rabbi Henry Brandt in 1968 urged the establishment of a progressive Jewish settlement in Israel and recommended that Leobeck College rabbinical students should spend a year of their studies in Israel. The commitment to Zionism and Israel grew ever stronger among progressive Jews in the UK during the 1960s and 70s, leading to the establishment of Pro-Zion, the UK branch of Atzenu, in 1978. The Association of Reform Zionists of America, ARTZA, which is the US branch of Atzenu, was founded in the same year after a resolution at the 1977 Union of American Hebrew Congregations 54th General Assembly Convention. The motivation for establishing a political presence for progressive Zionists in the various national Zionist forums was, from the UK perspective, twofold: to help existing progressive institutions in Israel and to ensure a progressive Jewish presence in the dialogue between Israel and diaspora Jewry through the Forum of the World Zionist Organization. It was in the Zionist arena that a major milestone for the recognition of progressive Judaism was achieved. In February 1978, at the 29th Zionist Congress in Jerusalem, the RSGB was represented by Bernard Davis, then a vice president. For the first time in its 80-year existence, the Congress recognized pluralism of Judaism, and a resolution was passed calling for equal treatment for every Jew, regardless of, these are the words from that original resolution, of his religious identification. It was not just the result of a sense of fair play, but reflected the enormous contribution of progressive communities in Britain and elsewhere to Zionism, whether financially, politically, through immigration, or in other ways. It was also evidence of the effective political influence that Pro-Zion and other constituents of Atzenu were beginning to exert, and we continue to build on that legacy. One of the few departures from the enthusiasm for Israel in the Reform movement was an article by Rabbi Lea Mühlstein in Living Judaism, pointing out the suffering of the Arabs and the danger of nationalism, leading Jews to become persecutors. Although it aroused considerable controversy, it gave voice to a concern felt by some, later to be echoed by many others. Similarly, liberal Jewish leaders were not shy in speaking out against the actions of the Israeli government. In January 1981, an article by Rabbi David Goldberg led to a significant controversy. In the article, Goldberg attacked the Begin government's policy in the occupied territories, declared that concerns about it were predominantly moral and not political, and criticized the leadership of the ULPS for not stating a progressive viewpoint on the issue. The officers responded that it was inappropriate for a religious organization to take an official view on what they perceived to be a political issue. The Rabbinic Conference, in turn, expressed its dismay at the action of the officers, while the ULPS Advisory Committee, to whom the matter was referred, could not agree on a unified recommendation to the Council, so divergent opinions were expressed. Nevertheless, it was agreed that individual rabbis and lay people had a right to express honestly held opinions. Now, if we start turning our perspective a little bit more to the contemporary time period, so moving swiftly through the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, we see that a deep yet not uncritical commitment characterized the progressive Jewish movement's attitudes towards Israel until today. When the affirmations of liberal Judaism were published in 1992, for instance, Israel appears as the third affirmation. We affirm our commitment to the state of Israel, our duty to seek its security, aid its development, support its absorption of immigrants, and further the fulfillment of the high ideals set out in its proclamation of independence. This was amended in the latest version from 2006 as the eighth affirmation. So Israel moved down a little bit from 3 to 8, where it says, we affirm our commitment to the state of Israel, our duty to seek its security, aid its development, support its absorption of immigrants, and further the fulfillment of the high ideals of justice and equality for all its citizens set out in its Declaration of Independence. We also commend all peace initiatives directed at both creating a state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel and establishing the conditions for peaceful coexistence between the two peoples. Similarly, in its mission statement, the UK Reform movement says about the relationship to Israel, maybe a little more boldly, we are unequivocally Zionist. We have a non-negotiable commitment to the state of Israel and its security. We believe that the pursuit of peace is the highest ideal and priority. We are deeply committed to democracy, human rights, and social justice, and religious pluralism. We are committed to two viable states as the only just and realistic solution to the present situation. We believe that Israel should be a Jewish state and a state for all its citizens. We believe that exponents of moderate liberal Judaism should ally with moderate liberal secularists and work together to combat both religious and secular extremism. Reform Judaism, it says, supports organizations dedicated to building bridges, both between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs and between Israeli Jews and Palestinians on the West Bank and in Gaza. All we can do is to support the people of goodwill, those dedicated to relief of suffering and those dedicated to building relationships of trust across the divide. Whilst much is outside our hands, small gestures of caring and support are always possible. Yet, despite the movement's strong support for Israel these days, many progressive Jews find themselves challenged by some of the realities of the state of Israel. The ongoing war in Gaza and the abandoning of 59 Israeli hostages, more than 50 years of occupation, a stalled peace process, and continued institutional discrimination against minorities, including non-Orthodox Jews, are just some of the list of grievances that progressive Jews hold. While it was possible for a long time to ignore these challenges, the actions of the most recent Israeli government, with its proposed judicial revolution and its determination to continue the war and expand the settlement enterprise, have brought the concerns for many progressive Jews to the fore. While there are some voices in our movements actively advocating for abandoning the Zionist cause, others have anchored their criticism of the current Israeli government in their Zionist values. The public image of Zionism in the UK has often been characterized as a right-wing, illiberal, and anti-democratic ideology, which stands in stark contrast to the beliefs of progressive Judaism. This has made it particularly challenging for the younger generation to identify themselves as Zionist. The rabbinic and lay leadership of the movements must therefore rise to the challenge not to allow this caricature to define the attitude of progressive Jews towards Israel and Zionism. I want to turn for a second to the late political theorist Judith Ann Sklar, who wrote in 1987 a little-known private note entitled Delusion and Sanity in Israel. And in it she says, "It is not because Israel is a moral beacon, but because we have an historical tie to its citizen, Jews all, that we ought to do our best to support those who share our political values." I personally believe that if we are to take the historic concerns of the founders of liberal and reform Judaism regarding the clash between Zionism and progressive Judaism's universal values seriously, we must lean in rather than step away from our relationship with Israel and support our Israeli sister movement as they work towards implementing the universal vision of progressive Judaism in Israel. Anthony Julius, the lawyer who defended Deborah Lipstadt in her libel trial against the Holocaust denier David Irving, suggests that progressive Zionists should adopt Judith Sklar's politics of fear into a Zionism of courage, which acknowledges the strength of the state of Israel, grasps Israel's history, and opposes rabbinic, coercive, and secular illiberal elements in Israel. It is this Zionism of courage that I believe must characterize our movement's attitude towards Israel and Zionism as the state of Israel is about to celebrate its 77th anniversary. As the news of the ugly, violent attack on the Memorial Day ceremony held at the Reform congregation in Ra'anana reached us last night, it is more clear now than ever that now is indeed the time for a Zionism of courage, a time to engage in the active pursuit of justice, a time to fight the rabbinic, coercive, and secular illiberal elements in Israel, a time to declare that right-wing illiberal parties do not have a monopoly over religious Zionism, a time to publicly declare that liberal religious Zionism is still very much alive, and a time to embrace that we need progressive Zionism today more than ever. Our progressive Jewish siblings in Israel do not have the privilege to turn their back on their home, and we must not abandon them, but rather stand side by side with them in their efforts to work towards the lofty vision of our prophets that Israel shall be a light unto the nation, a vision that was embraced by the founders of the State of Israel, writing in the Declaration of Independence that the State of Israel will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. So before I conclude to respond to some of the comments and questions that you have posed to me already, let me remind you that there's one simple thing, tangible thing that you can do right now. Take a photo of your passport or driver's license, find your payment card, and then go to uk.eventmagics.com, where you can register to vote in the upcoming World Zionist Congress elections for the cost of just £1. You will then be able to vote from the 8th of June for our joint list, Our Israel, a list together of liberal, reform, and Masorti Judaism, to help to send a clear message to the Israeli government. Just as was the case in 1978, when religious pluralism was recognized at the World Zionist Congress, the World Zionist Congress today still has the power to convey the vision of global Jewry for Israel. Let's make sure that in 2025, this is not the Haredi right-wing settler version, but rather a progressive Jewish vision committed to democracy, freedom, justice, and peace. So thank you for your attention. And I'm going to try very, very quickly to read through some of your comments. Now, there were some questions about what were alternatives that were proposed in the kind of pre-state era, or at the time when progressive Judaism was ambivalent or rejecting of the founding of a state. It's not so much that an alternative was necessarily proposed. I think there was a lot of focus on British Jewry amongst the emerging movements. And of course, there was a sense of allowing Eastern European Jews to come to England and to integrate them. And that was a lot of the work that the movements also did, of course, together with others. Now, David is expressing some views which maybe we can acknowledge that, yes, there is a lot of pain. None of us will deny the pain of the 7th of October. None of us denies the pain of the hostage families. I personally believe that the answer of the pain and grief is not revenge, but reconciliation, even if that might not be reconciliation today. But I just want to acknowledge that we're allowed to hold some varying views in this space as well. So Ilana posts about kind of the vision for the State of Israel as initially not really being focused on a religious vision. I think this is also why in the early years, our religious movements felt somewhat ambivalent toward the state, right? Because actually they were interested in religious renewal. They weren't interested in a secular project. Now, of course, demographics have changed. The diversity in Israel, both through immigration, but also through natural birth rate and so on, has changed. And the religious minorities are now hardly a minority. I mean, maybe nominally they're still a minority, but they are now a very powerful political voice in Israeli society. I should have said, one of the reasons why it is so important to have our involvement with the national institutions and the World Zionist Organization is that, of course, our movement in Israel does not have a political party that represents it. So the reform movement in Israel does not run in the Knesset elections. There is now a reform rabbi who is a member of Knesset, Rabbi Gilad Kariv, but he's a member of one of the political parties, now called the Democrats, formerly Avodah, the Labour Party. They came together with Meretz, but he's not there as a reform or progressive Jew. He's there as a representative of a political party. The reason that the Israeli reform movement never started a political party is that it acknowledged that many of its members of its congregations, choose to come to reform congregations as a religious, not a political choice. And while progressive Jews tend to be center-left, there is a fairly substantial minority of right-wing Likud voters amongst the membership of Reform Synagogue. So in order to not politicize congregational life, it did not feel that it was appropriate to run in the Knesset. So the only real means politically to be able to have a view vis-a-vis the Israeli government as a religious movement is through the World Zionist Organization. Now, Kana comments that, of course, can be argued that no society is perfect. That is, of course, absolutely true. No society is perfect. But just like progressive Jews are not shy in critiquing UK society or sometimes US society, it doesn't mean we cannot view Israel critically. We cannot question, we cannot hold divergent opinions, right? I think one of the things that we see is, interestingly, Israel was never the reason for an actual split. Apparently, in the reform movement, it came quite close. The Manchester London tension in the reform movement, at least based on, I'm basing all my knowledge about the history of the reform movement on Rabbi Jonathan Romain's excellent book. So if you want to know more, you probably ought to ask him rather than me. But apparently one of the tensions between Manchester and London was the attitude towards Zionism, but it never split our movement, right? There was always an embrace that we should be able to find a way to dialogue, to hear each other, and to disagree respectfully. So I want to just respond very briefly to the comment that Anne has posted. Anne has asked, living in London with all the animosity towards Israel and therefore Jews, I have largely kept my head down over the last 18 months. Is there anything you can recommend to say or do when confronted by this, so I'm not triggered every time they mention genocide, apartheid, etc., etc.? So I think, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge it's okay to feel triggered. Right? I think, and we are all triggered by different things. So some of us are triggered by things that we perceive anti-Zionist. Some people are triggered by things that they perceive to be nationalist, white, Jewish supremacy forms of Zionism. So I think, first of all, it's okay to be triggered. One of the things that I have found to be extremely effective in trying to dialogue across difference is not to say, you say so-and-so, but to say, when you say, I feel or I hear, to actually allow the other person in the conversation to see your humanity, to understand your perspective. In most cases, in my experience, the biggest disagreements are the ones that seem to stand in the air because we don't actually manage to talk to each other. I'm not trying to negate all difference. I think there are people that I thoroughly disagree with, and that thoroughly disagree with me, and that's okay. By the way, we can also be friends and not agree on all political issues. It's not like a first date question. My friends and I used to have this thing of, on the first date, always ask what their attitude towards the miners' strike is. But I'm joking. But we don't need to, right? We can be friends with each other, even if we acknowledge that we sometimes see things differently. I think what we should try to avoid is to say, because you don't agree with me, you're not as humanistic as me, or you're not as that. Now, I'm not saying that some things aren't anti-Semitic. A lot of things that are said in the name of anti-Zionism are really anti-Semitic. Often they're not intentionally anti-Semitic, right? So sometimes it's also important to explain why you hear something as anti-Semitic. Most people, especially most non-Jews, know very little about anti-Semitism and really don't understand what it looks like. And often we can't really say quite why it is. It's just something that you feel in your kishkis. But I just want to say these things are things where, when you try to express how something makes you feel, it helps break down the barrier. I just want to say one other thing about the words of genocide and apartheid and triggering. I often talk about the fact that if you want to try to have a conversation across difference, it's sometimes useful to avoid triggering language. So, for instance, I know that if I talk with someone who talks about Judea and Samaria, me starting to talk about the occupied territories will just be triggering to them, right? I might say that's just an objective description of what it is. But if I use, for instance, the language disputed territories, right? We can all agree there is a dispute. They think one thing, I think another. And so sometimes by shifting the language we use in our conversations, we can also sometimes dialogue across difference. How would I advise some liberal communities that are deeply divided in regards to Israel and Zionism? Thank you. I think we're going to try to do this as the final question. So what would I say is the advice? First of all, I think one of the most important things is to say it's okay to disagree. And to actually, rather than shy away from talking, to say, let's just share. And some of the techniques that work really well, first of all, it's good to bring in a good facilitator. One of the things that I do, less so now, but when I was the international chair of Atzenu, I did it quite a lot all over the world. I was partly chair during the pandemic, so I traveled from Australia to South Africa to Brazil all in one afternoon. But one of the things I did is I helped moderate conversations around Israel. And so having a good moderator can be very, very useful. Setting boundaries for the conversations. So to say, for instance, I invite you to share your own views, but to refrain from judgment or response to somebody else's view. Right? I mean, we all kind of respond or judge, at least as in our internal brain. I'm not naive, but if we try to process, try to take the time to actually hear and not already formulate how we can, defeat the other person, maybe we'll actually hear something that we wouldn't have heard otherwise. And then things like trying to be really transparent about what are terms that trigger you. Right. So I often do that at the start of a conversation. Let's do a word cloud of all the words that are triggering you, and then see if we can have a conversation where we avoid some of those terms. And oftentimes I find actually when you break through the shell, the differences aren't as large as they seem. oftentimes we are still motivated by a love for humanity, by our commitment to the dignity of every human being. We all have fears, right? They are just shaped by different experiences, by different relationships we have, right? Like for me, it's very difficult for me to be indifferent to Israel. So many of my close friends live there, right? When I see there is a siren, or right now there's wildfires raging in Israel, I don't think of like some political entity, the state of Israel or Zionism. I think like of my friends who are, trying to run away from the smoke, or when there is a siren, hiding huddled in a staircase in Tel Aviv. So my experience is very different to the experience, for instance, of someone else. On the other hand, I do also have Palestinian friends. And I have a friend who says, I hate my Israeli passport as a Palestinian. She's a Palestinian actress. She says, I will never win a film prize. In Israel, nobody will give a film prize to a Palestinian. In any of the Arab countries, nobody will give a film prize to an Israeli. Right? By getting to know a variety of people, we break down barriers. So if we can start to hear each other a little bit, to allow ourselves to question sometimes, I think we can make really great strides ahead.